Who funds these groups is a way of asking which section of 501 in the
Sure.
association do, how much of it is C3 philanthropic funding coming into these groups?
It varies. Some of them, like NAIC and stuff, I believe RC6s, they actually get some funding directly from some of the industry itself
Yeah.
and things of that nature. So it can be a variable issue. It can be variable as to how that works. Obviously, those kind of groups, in some sense, are even more concerning because if you're getting money that's coming directly from entities that you're regulating in some way, even if it's a somewhat roundabout way, it again can raise some questions and makes some of the transparency questions and things that we raised, I think, even more imperative at that point. And, there's other groups that, there's lots of C3s that do model legislation and do things like, and then do that. And a lot of those C3s, you want to be careful. It depends on who's involved, right? Again, how much it is. I think that if you're doing something that has to go through a legislative process after you've done something,
Yeah.
I think that's a very different animal than the rulemaking stuff.
Okay.
Because as it is, rulemaking is almost inherently uh, more technical, more nuanced, very much below the radar.
Yeah.
It's unlikely to get, press, state house reporters talking about what it is. And so I think that a lot of times when you have organizations that do model bills, it's important for people to know who those folks are too.
Yeah.
But those things are going to have to go through some kind of a legislative process by definition before they go, and chances are they're going to get modified, amended. Uh, I won't say it never happens, but rarely do you see a model bill not get very modified in a way that is very specific to the state by the time it goes through except for Nebraska, which is unicameral legislature. Most states have two chambers, and things happen as you go through the cumbersome process of legislating. Uh, these other groups, I think, is where that's a lot less of that happens because there's not the kind of the normal poll process, the trading and polling and push polling process you get within the legislative process, which is
Mhm.
again why we took a little bit more of a narrow focus here because obviously almost any entity, or I won't say any entity, but lots of entities say, well, these are our policy preferences, or here is something that we think you should do. But most of them at that point are advocating much more transparently. Plus, most of those organizations do file things like 990s and things like that, which has a transparency component, which is a very important thing. Uh, some of these other groups, and sometimes it might fall outside a lot of the C3s. I mentioned National Association of Insurance Commissioners, called NAIC. They are a C6. They have a dispensation where they don't file a 990. So they file they do file reports that are on their website where you can look at it, but they don't have to file that. And that seems to be a very an odd thing to where you don't have the same kind of IRS transparency that you do for a lot of the other nonprofit
How
groups.
did they get that dispensation? Uh,
I actually tried to find because I wanted to put that in the report, and they do have a description that they got essentially a dispensation from the IRS. I think as far back as the 1990s, late 90s or something, and nobody gave me an answer yet. It's actually something I still have a question out, but we went ahead and we published the general report. But it is a great question because I think people would kind of want to know about that because you can file your annual report and that's okay. I think it's important to do, and a lot of people aren't going to want to look at that. But again, there's the official, and then there's the thing the bells and whistles, nice, pretty pamphlet sort of annual report that gets
yeah.
published versus this is the facts and nothing but the facts, ma'am, kind of kind of thing,
Yeah.
which is what you get when you have those kind of disclosures.
Is the American Legislative Exchange Council, generally considered conservative, writes model laws,
Mhm.
suggests them, proposes them? Is that a rulemaking NGO? Does the thinking apply to them?
I
It.
think I think that kind of as I was saying earlier, there's a bit of a distinction there. Obviously, they have some degree of influence because they have legislators who come and speak and do things and carry model bills and sometimes will come back. But because it's legislative by its very nature, and because you have to go through a legislative process, it has a far different impact. It doesn't have the whole concept of being a Trojan horse is you've got something that's kind of hidden inside there, and then it comes out when you're least expecting it. In this case, this stuff, I know a lot of people are very negative about them or some stuff like that, but at the end of the day, what they do is pretty transparent when it comes back to a state house. I mean, you get a bill introduced, it's got hearings, people testify, there's amendments, and there's things like that. I mean, obviously, there's always gamesmanship that can happen, but in general, we have a point of order and a rule of order and how those things happen. It's when you have something like, um, what happened here in Ohio. We have a pretty good, like I said before, a robust rule thing. We have a joint committee that oversees stuff, but we had an issue where our division of securities was essentially doing circulars to securities advisors and things of that nature that didn't go through that process, even though it's a statutory process. And we had people coming to Jake. It's called the Joint Committee and Agency Rule Review here in Ohio. And we had people having to come and testify to JCAR and say, these guys are actually doing stuff that's not even through JCAR. You're not looking at these rules at all, which you should be. And so they're doing policy without rulemaking, but they're still essentially implementing a policy. Well, that is a very different thing than anything that Alec ever does because, this is a situation where you have an agency just sending a letter out to the licensees and legislators have no idea. It's not probably I mean, it's public in the sense that I guess they send the letter out and that's a public letter, but they did it. There was no discussion about why they were doing it other than that they made a reference to certain things that were models out of a different organization, I think it was North American Securities Administrators Association in that case.
How far should transparency go in this context? And I ask for the following reason. I'm trying to make your life difficult where you work. The Buckeye Institute has an interest in donor privacy in the
Sure.
C3 and C4 context. I'm thinking C3 here. Should a rule-making NGO that's a C3 have to, according to a transparency recommendation from, I guess, the Buckeye Institute,
If you have
donors are?
policymakers that
Yeah.
are directly like involved in those drafting situations, and then you're coming back and you're trying to implement a rule without going through a legislative process, I think that's a big delineation line. It's about the process by which things actually get implemented to the extent that they have the force of law. And that's where I do think organizations like ALEC or us or other, think tank organizations are different. Plus, we do file, 990s and stuff as well. So we do have public disclosures that we do. And we obviously follow all of those kind of requirements. And anybody can go to GuideStar and look at things like that. And in theory, request it and you give it. So in that sense, I think there's a transparency that's inherent to things that we're doing that is not necessarily there for these other things, which is why it requires a little bit more. And again, we're not having, it's not like you have 20 different regulators in your industry, a banking industry, an insurance or a securities thing on a committee. They pass something and then they kind of slide it in under a circular that doesn't go through any other process when they come back to their state. That's not the kind of thing that any of us do. So I would say that's a very significant distinction. I think there's already pretty good transparency. I think there's good reasons for why there's donor privacy when we're talking about private donors and things like that. That goes back to, not to go down the rabbit hole too far, but things back, the NAACP, even back in the day, had there were some less than positive reasons why people sometimes want to go in that direction. And sometimes I think that when they say transparency, what they really are moving towards is potentially going into the realm of harassment and things like that. And that's a very different thing. This is just saying, look, you are a very specific entity whose almost exclusive goal for existing is to be modifying and changing things that are rules that will impact vast numbers of folks within different industries. You're involved in that. You're directly doing it, and you're not having to share as much as a lot of those other groups are.
Mhm. How about foreign funding? Any foreign funding coming into these sort of rulemaking NGOs? Maybe
Well, a couple of them actually have some outside entities like that are multi-country now, like the securities one I was referring to. Technically, it's mostly Western North American. That's actually the name of the organization is North American, but it does include Canada. It does include Mexico.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that, and there's always a concern. I know there's always been some concern. We probably have obviously there's always, because when you have a foreign influence, you have an open process, there's going to be opportunities for that. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's inherently wrong. Again, a lot of this is not that there's something inherently wrong with what these folks are doing. It's just how they sometimes get things accomplished aren't being done as openly as it should be, and we need to make sure that's done. So I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a terrible thing. It depends on this, I guess, the circumstances. There's not a and I'd have to look back again to see how much money actually is coming in from that. So I don't have the exact answer to know like what the percentage is. I don't think it's an overwhelming amount, but obviously, folks, if that's there and people want to put something into like a state statute that does it, I know there's concerns about that and various campaign financings, of course,
Yeah.
when we do
Well,
political
donor
election
freedom
issues.
comes up as
Hmm?
an objection. I'm on the donor freedom thing again, which would come up as an objection to even asking.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think donor, and I think again, we've taken a strong stand on the donor privacy because, but again, I think that we're talking about most of these, a lot of those groups are not doing some of the same things that some of the NGOs are doing.
Yeah.
That the rulemaking NGOs that I refer to, I think that delineation is pretty important.
You mentioned DEI kind of at the beginning, and there's a little bit of a trick question here, but how much DEI stuff works? I'm thinking of like higher ed accreditation body,
Sure.
something like that. Uh, this has been a tool, a way, an avenue through which DEI policies have been uh, imposed. Is kind of strong, but furthered.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't it? So how did that happen? What can be done about it? Transparency might help, I suppose, especially now.
Well, I think that's certainly true. I think we'll see what happens. I mean, we got a new administration coming to Washington here.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be a lot of pushback. I know there's a lot of pushback in Ohio. And actually, there's a lot of pushback at the higher ed place in Ohio. It's a little bit outside the scope of this, but I think though that if you've got an entity that's saying, these are the principles here, and we're going to start passing things where it's going to come through into your code in some way,
Yeah.
uh, I think legislators have a right to say, we ain't going to do that. They just need to be aware about it. And to the extent that they're not, that's the problem. So yeah, I think transparency is part of it. And we had some recommendations, by the way, in the report about opening up some of the books about what are, especially when you have a particular state official direct involvement, there should be a little more disclosure about what they're doing when they're at some of these conferences and some of the votes that are being taken, just so that the people are aware of it. Obviously, if you don't have something like what Ohio has, where we have the agency entity that's a legislative body looking over it, you should probably have one. The legislature should be involved, not just rubber stamping things, but actually taking a look at it. And if something is coming up, that it should be disclosed that it came through this entity, and that should make sure that the legislatures are looking over it. They may say it's fine, they may say yay to it, and that's okay if that's what they do. But they should have the opportunity to do it. So we tried to make sure that we put the legislature back in the driver's seat. I guess that's really the big takeaway of the report, is putting the legislature back, which gets your earlier question about, is that asking too much? And I think I was probably a little long-winded in it, but is to say that it is asking a lot, but it's not asking too much because that's what they're
Ah,
supposed to do.
yeah. Yeah. Uh, every state could do a report like yours, right? Or are some states relying more on non-government organizations
Oh,
than
every
not?
state should at least take a look at it and take a look at this, and because chances are several of the ones that are mentioned here, they're not just involved. Ohio happens to have a pretty prominent role in a couple of these organizations, but most states probably have somebody from their respective regulatory agencies that are participating in some way or another, and you could certainly take a look at it and do that, or look, you can take our report and then just do that basic thing and do a deeper dive. I think now between what we've done here, and again, I'd like to give credit to the Texas Public Policy Foundation for doing one before we did, and it was a nice piece, and it's what kind of prompted me to do it and go a little bit deeper, and somebody else might maybe go even a little bit deeper if they want to as well on there. And I would definitely encourage other state, whether it's think tanks, other organizations, good citizen groups, to just again look into it, ask their legislators about it, uh, make their legislators aware about it, which is the second piece of this. And you don't necessarily, if you've already got some rulemaking, some oversight capacity, you don't have to reinvent the wheel per se. You just have to add a few extra things on there to make sure that there's extra caution being taken before we go forward and just let these things happen. Oh, and I should say, because our JCAR on this Social Security thing I mentioned before, they have been pushing the agency to come back before them, and that's going to be an ongoing thing. And in fact, there may be have to be some additional things done to put some extra fire there to make sure there's
Yeah.
compliance. But they're aware now because of some of the things that have happened. We've got a handful of legislators that are aware, and I think this report is making it even more aware because I'm going to be talking to a bunch more of them about it, and I think that's going to really help to do that. So if you have a situation that happens in your state, where something similar happens. If you've got policy being made by agencies that got a model from one of these from an entity that's like a national organization of this nature, and they're not going through a formal rule process, and the legislators don't know anything about it, you should probably do something about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Your recommendations really don't necessarily require a statute. It's the
They
existing.
don't necessarily do it. It could be done that way,
Yeah.
and in some cases it might be. It probably doesn't hurt if you do that to make sure that you have that force of law. And again, to some extent, just the process of getting a statute on the books, the legislative process itself raises awareness in a way and of its own that I think has some potential benefit too. But no, it wouldn't have to be done that way.
Yeah. Is there anything, Greg, that I did not ask or that you wanted to answer and wasn't giving an opportunity?
I think this was great. Again, I kind of stress this is a situation where we live in a very complicated age. There does need to be expertise there. Legislators can't do everything, but they need to be in the driver's seat looking around. They need to be aware of what's going on. That's their constitutional prerogative. We can't let things slide under. We've been winning some big battles at the national level with things again like Chevron deference. Um, this is kind of in the same general wheelhouse, a little bit distinct, but it's similar in the sense that what we're trying to do now is rein back in some of the administrative state, if you will. It's a real thing. It exists. It's grown. It wasn't like this 100 years ago. And while there's always going to be a need for some degree of rules, we need to be able to right size those things and have people in charge. And if you don't know what's happening, if you kind of have I kind of call it the Donald Rumsfeld unknown unknowns. If it's an unknown unknown, you got a real problem because then things are happening. So let's make sure that we just let people be aware, bring the accountability back. It doesn't mean stop everything, but it just means bringing accountability to the table.
Well, Greg Lawson of the Buckeye Institute, thanks so much for doing this with us.
Sure.